And welcome. Good afternoon and welcome to the Way of the National Capital Area's Changemakers Education Series. I am Nadelka Phillips, Senior Vice President of Marketing and Fundraising here at United Way of the National Capital Area. United Way NCA is uniquely positioned at the intersection of public, private, philanthropic, and nonprofit sectors to bring the best resources, individuals, and organizations together to solve our region's most pressing issues facing our community today. Today is our 9th in a 10-part education series where we convene thought leaders and conversations focused on trends in the National Capital Area and solutions that advance equity in the region. Over the last year, we've covered topics such as women in the workforce, increasing economic opportunity for men of color, engaging youth voices in voting rights, addressing systemic barriers that create health disparities during a public health crisis, just to name a few. In honor of Black History Month, today we're going to take a closer look at how the racial uprisings and social unrest in 2020 have led to expanded support of racial equity and racial justice focused grant making and increased funding to Black-led organizations. But history shows that responses can be short-term, that attention shifts, and that structural change requires focus. Will recent efforts lead to structural and sustained change on how philanthropy relates to increased investment in Black-led and Black-serving organizations for the long term, uplifting freedom for all communities? Joining me today to dive deeper into this subject is Stephanie Sneed, Director for the Fund for Black-led Change at the Meyer Foundation. As a change agent who has worked as both grantee and grantor, supporting Black communities across the National Capital Area, Stephanie will share how the fund fulfills the foundation's commitment to racial equity and making deep investments into Black leadership and building the Black movement. Stephanie will address how the Meyer Foundation's work has been focused on racial equity since 2015 and serves as a novel, but not necessarily new, role that philanthropy has in making systemic shifts. These shifts are critical for reducing barriers for Black-led and Black-serving organizations to access the resources they need to grow and lift the communities that they serve. We will discuss the successes and challenges she has experienced in leading this type of change and the call for other grant makers to join the movement to make funding more racially equitable for all in the National Capital Area. But before we get started with Stephanie, I want to share some insights with you. So every 2 years, United Way releases an ALICE report. ALICE is an acronym for Asset Limited, Income Constraint, but Employed. And that represents a growing number of individuals and families working, but just unable to make ends meet. They are making right above the federal poverty level, but unable to make ends meet. To put ALICE into perspective, there are more than 500,000 households in the National Capital Area that represents the ALICE population. We all know ALICE. They may be our friend, our relative, a coworker, or even a neighbor. ALICE household spans all races, ages, ethnicities, and abilities. However, and I need to underscore this, households of color are disproportionately ALICE. The ALICE reports help reshape how we understand financial hardships and the ongoing challenges so many in our community face today, particularly those in the Black and Brown communities. All of your United Way NCA efforts in capturing ALICE helps us guide our work moving forward, working with thought leaders across the region to bring resources and solutions in our 3 key pillars of impact of health, education, and economic opportunity for the ALICE population. With all that in mind, I'm going to get started with our conversation. So Stephanie, welcome. I want to start with some data here before I go into the first question. So the first, according to Charity Navigator, in 2019, only 4% of the $450 billion charitable dollars went to organizations led by a Black, Indigenous, or Latino leader. Data shows that BIPOC-led nonprofits are less likely to receive corporate donations, sales revenue, revenue from the federal government, and investment income. For example, according to the Nonprofit Finance Fund in 2021, 71% of white-led nonprofits received corporate donations versus 58% for BIPOC-led. So with those stats, we can get started. Let's talk about racial equity and how it plays a part in the current giving landscape and what is the long-term impact on Black communities.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm going to talk locally because that is the bulk of my experience. So I will say there are really just a handful of local funders who are centering racial equity in their work. But nearly every funder is funding work that impacts communities of color. So whether they're explicit or not about funding racial equity work, even in issues as kind of like benign as food access, we know that to be an issue of racial equity. You brought up, Alice disproportionately impacts communities of color. Food inequity also disproportionately impacts communities of color. We can go down the line with almost every single, unjust policing, housing insecurity, all of those things are issues of racial equity. They're maybe not always framed that way though. So I think that's kind of the first thing that I think about in terms of the giving landscape is being, honest and upfront and actually naming the thing, right? So particularly in the, Washington, D.C. region, where, in DC and Prince George's County, Northern Virginia, Montgomery County, we have large, communities of color, many who have a huge difference in income from their white counterparts. We do not have a large white low-income community in this area. So when we talk about poverty, when we talk about low-income communities, we're talking about communities of color. So I think it's really important for us to actually put a name to that. And I think that helps get us on the way to actually talking about racial equity. And so I think actually by digging a little bit deeper, we have to actually confront anti-Blackness specifically in our assumptions about some of these nonprofits, specifically Black nonprofits, Black-led nonprofits. It's something that has come up a lot with the groups that I work with within the Fund for Black-led Change, where funders and donors, maybe they don't say it specifically or outright, but they don't see those groups as fiscally responsible or able to manage money in the same way that they might see another group doing similar work. And so I think really confronting the anti-Blackness in our assumptions of Black nonprofits not being able to do this work when often the issue is capacity, which becomes kind of like a double-edged sword when if that's our excuse for not funding a group because they don't have the capacity, they're never going to have the capacity. And that actually, continues the cycle of Black-led groups not being able to actually do as impactful work as they we know that they can do. I am seeing more funders confronting the reality of their inequitable beginnings. So how they made their money, Meyer Foundation included, was often in ways that took away from these communities, specifically communities of color, low income communities where these foundations were able to amass large amounts of wealth while these communities suffered and, could have used the wealth. I know back in my advocacy days in DC, we talked a lot about DC's rainy day fund and talked about the fact that, for so many, it's been pouring. So we talk about having this rainy day fund when there are people who are in the midst of a storm. And I think that also, I'm not sure about what the long-term impact looks like for this type of funding. It is somewhat recent. As you named, Meyer has been doing it since 2015, which really, for the trajectory of the Meyer Foundation, is pretty short. So it's hard for us to turn and say, well, what has the impact been? Because we don't actually know what the impact has been quite yet. But, just kind of from the fund, even we're at the top of year 3 of a 5-year funding cycle. We've seen some really tremendous growth in the organizations that we've been able to fund. In fact, really excited, 2 of our Fund for Black-led Change organizations got funding from McKinsey Scott last year, which was huge for them. They're able to expand their work. They're able to continue doing the work that they were already doing, but at a higher level because they're able to staff up. They're able to pay people salaries that, match, what the cost of living in this area is, which is pretty high. They're able to sustain employees. We know that nonprofit work is very transitional. often because the work is difficult and because the pay is not as high. And I think that also, it brings attention to the fact that those who are closest to the problem are also closest to the solution. So when we see groups, I'm thinking of a group called African Communities Together, who is a great group. If you're not familiar with them, you should check them out. They've been doing a lot of work around African immigrants nationwide, but specifically in the area. And they had a campaign in Virginia where they were working with an apartment complex called Southern Towers, and were able to, after the building was purchased, they were able to maintain folks' ability to stay in the building. They're able to start addressing issues of repairs that were not being made, of maintenance issues, of rodents. And because of the work that they did with African immigrant communities, they already had an in with those communities. They had trusted relationships. And so they were able to easily go in, maybe not easily, but they were able to go in and use those relationships to really organize those communities to really make changes for themselves because they were already close to the solution.
Wow, that is just, real fascinating stuff as you were talking about that, just some progress that has been made, but yet so much that needs to be made. So that leads me to our next question. That's, studies show that BIPOC-led organizations were more likely than white-led organizations to take public action about racial equity. So 48% of BIPOC-led organizations have been actively engaged in advancing racial equity for the 5 years plus, as compared to 29% of their white-led organizations. So when we think about advancing racial equity, how can the philanthropic sector be change agents and better support Black-led organizations in the Black community?
Yeah, and so something you actually mentioned in your intro was that a lot of these organizations did see a rise in support in 2020. Those organizations, unsurprisingly, were at the front line, not just of the racial uprisings that happened in the summer of 2020, but also the COVID response. A lot of the groups that we work with within the Fund for Black-led Change were some of the groups who were doing mutual aid work, were doing some of that rapid response work in communities. In March of 2020, when everything kind of shut down, there was a lot of confusion, there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of people who didn't know what the next steps were going to be, but they knew that their kids were not at school, but didn't have access to computers. They knew that, some of the social service agencies who they regularly maybe participated in or attended, their doors were shut and they went virtual, and maybe they didn't have access to a computer or internet. And some of these very same groups were the kind of what I would call like first responders in the community. And so we know that these groups are doing the work. And we know that, people saw that in 2020. And so these groups also saw an increase in funding, both from philanthropy and also, contributions from individuals as well. What unfortunately has also happened is that has not sustained itself. So a lot of times they were one-time grants or one-time donation. And then folks kind of moved on. And that is something that, I constantly hear from the leaders of these groups was actually really, really harmful because they got this influx of money and, obviously it changed what their budget looked like for the next year. And people thought, they're good, we funded them. When that, as somebody who works in an organization, one-time money doesn't bring you on new staff because you can't sustain a staff person if you don't actually know that you have the money to keep them on year after year. It doesn't actually give you the capacity. In fact, you're dealing so much with that influx of money that you don't actually have the capacity to go out and spend it immediately. And so, kind of going back to that anti-Black myth of being fiscally irresponsible, where groups are getting this money in so quickly, but don't have the infrastructure to spend it as quickly. And folks are looking for that really fast return, right? Like, I gave money today, what's happening tomorrow? And then, I would also say that because of this, it doesn't really actually allow the organizations to be responsive rather than reactive. And so folks are looking for a reactive sort of, we gave the money, what's happening now? Did we solve police brutality? When we know for, any type of systems change work, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And so unfortunately, after, we kind of moved on after quarantine was over and we all got to go back outside and eat at restaurants and do the things we were missing. These groups are still doing the work, but it wasn't being sustained at the same level. And so I think that is something that we as a community can do a lot better at supporting these groups with consistent funding. And I think that's one of the things that we are attempting to do through the Fund for Black-Led Change, which, does provide 5 years of funding, which I will even say as a self-critique, that's not enough, because we know that 5 years is not going to change any of these regions quite yet. But we need to actually be there through the times when nobody else is there, right? Because that means that, unfortunately, with kind of how cyclical things are, the next time that something happens, whether it's a pandemic, whether it is an uprising or whatever, that the groups will actually be prepared in advance, and they're not going to be receiving money at the same time. So trying to staff up as they're trying to run campaigns, but they'll be prepared and they'll be ready. And because they are closest to communities, they'll be able to actually really be responsive in a way that is not harmful, not transactional, but actually like built in these deep relationships that they've been working on, both with us as funders, because we'll be a trusted funder at that point, hopefully, but also with the communities that they work with to really hear what communities need directly from them and be able to be responsive in that way, instead of just saying, well, we hear you need masks and, flooding them with masks, and that's not actually what people are saying that they need. So actually like hearing and listening and really being in deep relationship with the communities.
You've said there's so much in that I just want to tease out, and I'm going a little off script here if you don't mind, but really to talk about, you mentioned infrastructure, right? So they got the influx of dollars coming in, the foundation of the infrastructure that it allowed for them to build so that they're prepared for the future. One of the things that, just how are you seeing the conversation probably having to repeat over and over about the consistency and how important that is? Because again, infrastructure being important, and you can't build infrastructure at the drop of a dime, right? You really do need the time, the space to be able to do that. So how are those conversations, even in the spaces that you're in, how are people receiving that?
Yeah, I think I've seen a variety of responses. I've seen folks who really get it, right? I think that even if you don't specifically look at, racial equity work, right? If you look at something kind of similar to the analogy before, but let's think about repro justice, right? So last year, a lot of groups were faced with kind of having to do this in the moment, very quick, reactionary type of work once Roe v. Wade status changed. And I think folks saw that and were really clear that, hey, had we been funding some of these groups who are on the front lines for a longer trajectory, they could have better been responsive. And so I think folks see that and are able to kind of align that with the fight for racial justice as well. I do think that there are, one critique of philanthropy is that, oftentimes it is kind of like, what is the shiny new thing, right? And so folks in 2020 were very excited about funding Black-led groups. And in 2022, we're very excited about funding repro justice groups. Now, there, of course, is like intersection. But, kind of moving from one issue to the next without that consistency is pretty harmful. And I think that some funders are recognizing that, and some still have some work to do.
Wow. So back on script. The question, let's shift our conversation to advocacy and policy change. According to the Nonprofit and Finance Fund in 2021, 59% of BIPOC-led organizations publicly advocated for policies to advance racial equity in the communities that they serve, compared to 41% of white-led organizations. So what does supporting continuous and ongoing policy changes that are equitable and more inclusive of marginalized communities and their needs, as well as societal changes, look like when it comes to Black-led organizations and Black service providers?
Yeah, I guess circling back to, I think maybe I'm like even answering some of these questions before you ask them, but circling back, the groups who I see who are most effective are centering constituents. They're centering folks who are directly impacted. You know, one of the things that I recognized back in my advocacy days was often, you know, I'd be down at the Wilson building and the people who were being talked about, the people who this policy was supposed to change their lives, they weren't there. They weren't testifying, they weren't brought into any of these focus groups. And so policies and decisions were being made in absence of the folks who actually are going to be most directly touched by these. And so the groups who I think are doing like really amazing work, I mentioned African Communities Together, we have DC Justice Labs, we have quite a few groups who do the work of centering constituent voices. And that doesn't just mean trotting them out when it's time to testify, but actually working with them from the very inception of some of these policies, doing, you know, deep work in communities to actually find solutions where they come from, and really centering the relationships and the dignity of constituents. And so not treating them as if they are just kind of recipients of, you know, donations or recipients of services, but actually partners and, you know, folks who have opinions and thoughts and experiences that really can develop and shape policy in a way that is meeting the needs that they have. And so the groups who I see doing that are the ones who are doing it best. And they really, I think, are deeply intentional. And, you know, I think that also circles into, you know, hiring folks from the community, making sure that folks are represented at every stage of decision making. And so you're not just bringing them in to, you know, check off that, yes, we you know, we passed it by you, but actually at the beginning stages where you're coming up with ideas and brainstorming them and having folks at every single stage to be deeply involved, I think is really important. And I think, you know, completely shifts what policy can look like.
Wow. Yeah, getting that voice right at the table is critically important. And it's not just to your point about, you know, checking a box. It's not just, oh yeah, we have representation, but truly hearing and really implementing what you're hearing from folks, I think is critically important. And so I agree with you there. So shifting, so how can we transform our definition of philanthropy and make it a collaborative process for shared decision-making, you know, across and proximate with leadership?
Yeah, so I really liked this question. I actually am in a philanthropy group right now where we've been doing a bit of study, and something that kind of shook me to my core was, you know, this idea of philanthropy that I think we often talk about as being so separated from community and so separated from, in particular, Black communities. But when you think about philanthropy, or at least when I think about philanthropy and think about giving and charity, a lot of that to me started with going to church with my grandma and she give me a couple of quarters for my pocketbook. And that was how I understood giving and philanthropy to be. And so I think if we, you know, dig back into our roots and we think about philanthropy in the way that, you know, maybe I wish I had asked you to pull these numbers because I don't have the figure off the top of my head, but I do know that, you know, on average, Black people give at much higher levels, regardless of income. And so I think that, you know, for that, philanthropy starts at home. It is something that most of us have practiced for most of our lives, whether it's, letting a family member live with you, or, taking care of your elderly relative, or filling in the gaps that exist in public services. Philanthropy is something that we have done. And so I think doing some reframing of that, and letting us know that, philanthropy is not something that just, wealthy white people engage in. We all engage in philanthropy. And that means we all have a stake in it, right? And so, when we think about it like that, I think that it makes me think about how much work we have to make all of philanthropy transformative in that way, and really centered in community, that the decisions that philanthropy makes should be centered in, what people in those communities are calling for. There's a foundation in DC, they're called IF, a Foundation for Radical Hope. I think I said it right. They have a new name, so
They did change their name recently. Yes, I think you're right.
Excuse me if I got that second part, but they're called the IF Foundation. And they have done some really transformative work of bringing community members into decision-making. They actually, I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago, completely shifted their board. They brought community members onto their board. And I think that's something that to me is just completely turning philanthropy on its head by bringing folks who are most directly impacted into that highest level of decision making, into who actually gets the grants. And so I'd be really excited to see more foundations, including my own, make that shift in terms of decision making. I think when we think about the biggest decisions that we make as philanthropists, who gets the money and how much money is the biggest one. And that's often done kind of behind closed doors and with not a lot of transparency around how it happens. And so when folks don't get the funding, they don't necessarily know how that happened. Or when folks do get the funding, it might feel like kind of a stroke of luck. And so to be more honest and transparent about that. And I think that, that shared leadership, that shared kind of decision-making is how we transform philanthropy, is how we make it accessible to everyone, because I don't think that philanthropy is just for wealthy people. I think that philanthropy is something that we all engage in and we all should have a stake in.
I love that. And when you were talking about your grandmother with the pocketbook and the change and all that, and going to church and tithing, and you're right. And I think the word philanthropy sometimes feels like you're excluding a group of people because it's fancy. It seems like a fancy word, a big word for giving and to serving and to giving back. And so tying it back and really at the core from the very beginning of giving back when you were a little girl, of course, and to what you do today. But to your point, we all in one way or another have, show up in philanthropy in one way, or another. So thanks for that. I think I'm going to ask you one more question, and we're going to check in with our team here to see if anyone is putting some questions in the Q&A box. We'll be attending to those soon. But my question for you is, how can Black service providers highlight their work to be more visible and appealing to funders? So you started to touch on that a little bit, in that there's this nebulousness that goes into it, right? You don't know why you get a yes sometimes, and you don't know why you get a no. And so when you're thinking about, a lot of the funders, those are people, white people, organizations, white-led organizations making those decisions. And when you are, you have this kind of sense around Black communities, Black-led communities, community-led organizations that are really, kind of they don't know what to do with the funding. They're not so sure. There's the stereotypes there. What are your thoughts around how can we position ourselves to be more viable, more attractive to the funders that are making these decisions?
Yeah. So in my previous position, I was an executive director. It was my first time at that type of leadership. And as an executive director of a very small organization, one of the biggest tasks on my plate was fundraising. And it was something I felt so deeply uncomfortable with. within my family, and I know a lot of other Black families and families of color, talking about money is very taboo. And so it was a huge hurdle for me to be able to be in conversation. And mind you, this is my organization's money. This isn't my personal money.
Right.
But to be in conversation, and I actually, had some coaching. And one of the things that I learned was that, oftentimes other white executives don't have any problem calling up a funder and asking for money, or using their relationships to get a foot in the door, to get themselves in that room. And that's something that I struggled with. And I see a lot of the other groups within the Fund for Black-led Change struggle to get over that hurdle of, using their relationships. And so when I when I transitioned to philanthropy, it was very funny because, everybody who I had previously worked with, I was now like a new Stephanie to them. Same Stephanie, but different access. And, a lot of, white people who I worked with, they were in my inbox before I even was, at Meyer. I came on my first day and I already had emails in my inbox from these people who had figured out the algorithm for how my, first initial last name at Meyer was going to be. And I actually had to seek out a lot of, mind you, my title is director for the Fund for Black-led Change. So I wasn't going to be funding their organizations anyway, but they wanted to have conversations with me. They wanted to let it be known that if they were a Meyer grantee, they wanted to continue being a Meyer grantee. If they weren't a Meyer grantee, they wanted to sell themselves to me. And I think that's something that, Black-led groups can learn from, is to be a little bit more proactive and to, I know that as my role at Meyer, I should be open to, and I am open to folks reaching out to me to have conversations. And even if the answer is no, I have them in my mind, and I will remember eventually if they apply to Meyer, or if they, keep me on their email listserv. I'll read the emails that they send in, and I'll be updated about their work. And so I think that there is, some low stakes things people can do, reaching out to funders. If you are, I've definitely, as a grantee, I've been invited to do different things with funders. As soon as I get off the call with the funder, add them on LinkedIn, make that connection right there. Even if you don't engage with them on LinkedIn, then things that you post then pop up on their feed. So I think some of that is, really important to kind of getting folks' attention and, making yourself and your organization stand out. I think another thing that people don't consider is social media. It's not just, your community who looks at it. Funders are looking at social media as well. Having a nicely curated social media page and calling attention to it, having it in your, bios, having it, as your email signature. I think, to me at least, I'm like, oh, let me click on that and see what they're up to. And then, lastly, I will just say something I've seen, a lot of the Black-led groups I work with do really well. And I think they should continue to do is just, expand the way that you talk about the work, having great visuals, having great videos, having, kind of interactive approaches. When I was at my last job, one of the first things I noticed is, we had this budget report we put out every year. And one of the things I was tasked with on my very first day was like reading through these budget reports. And they were like these 20-page thick, very like technical. And I was so bored. And I was like, well, if I'm not really interested in reading this and I'm getting paid to do it, probably not many other people are going to be interested in either. So how can we switch it? And if you actually, I think they released it this year. So it's Fair Budget Coalition. They just released their FY24. Oh my gosh, FY24 budget report. And it is so beautiful. It has like great artwork. They've changed the language. It's very accessible. So even though I am no longer super connected to DC advocacy, I can understand the recommendations. And I think, engaging folks where they're at and thinking about who your audience is also really important.
Fantastic. That's great advice. And I wrote that down because I need to go look at that beautiful document that they provided. So I'm gonna see if we have any questions in the Q&A box. So my colleague Aja, if you can let me know if there are any questions in the Q&A, or I can just keep on going.
We don't have any questions just yet, but I want to encourage the folks on the line to go ahead and drop any questions that you have in our Q&A file here. And Nadelka, you can go ahead and read the next question you have. Maybe we can see if someone will go ahead and put something in the chat there.
Sure. So the next question that I have has to do, how do we advance racial equity in giving and mobilizing positive change for the national capital area is the next question.
Yeah. So I think that we have to be less scared to talk about racial equity. I know that nationally, it can be a hot button issue to specifically name what something is. But I think that, like I mentioned, most of the groups in this area are doing work that is centered towards a particular demographic. They might not be saying it, but they are. So being reflective about that and not being scared to talk about it, I think is really important. I also think, it is kind of a matter of folks who are coming from really large organizations or who have kind of like some of those, I've worked at some really large organizations in the area, and their access to, donors who are making 1,000, 10,000, or even bequeathing money to their organizations is not uncommon for them, but it is uncommon for some of the organizations who are doing, some of this really good work and who are smaller and have smaller capacity. So I think, doing some resource sharing amongst organizations is really important, even if that is, of course, as an organization, you probably don't want to give up the money that you're getting, but even making those introductions or talking and naming some of the groups who, are doing work with you. I don't think, there's kind of like this scarcity myth that there's only a certain amount. And if somebody else gets X, then I'm not going to get Y. But if we actually are committed to solving any of these issues of inequity or injustice, we have to resource share. We have to, talk about these things up front, and we have to be really clear about the fact that if we are in a position of privilege, how do I share that privilege? How do I, cut the pie into a few more pieces so everybody can eat?
I love that. And as you were talking about, even if we're not talking about it, you are serving the population. It's really about race, when you peel back the onion. And before we go to, I do see a question, I see a couple in the Q&A, but I just wanted, the other piece of it is around the data, right? And the data doesn't lie. Like, you can tell the communities that are being served, the organizations that are helping to serve those communities, who is leading them, where the money's going. The data, if you really center yourself around it, it really does, tell a story. So I'm going to turn it over to Aja for the Q&A box. I see a couple questions that have popped up.
Yes, thanks, Nadelka. So for the first question we have is, for foundations that have stubborn leadership, how do we get them to give up some of their decision-making power? That's a very good question.
That's a great question. You got to organize. I know we think about community organizing as like getting in the streets and rallying people, but you have to do that internal organizing, right? So wherever that leadership is, if they are uncomfortable talking about race, then y'all have to have some sessions about race. You have to be clear about what the areas of growth are, and be realistic. You're not going to get a board who is uncomfortable with these things to turn over all the reins of leadership tomorrow. But think about some realistic goals that you can have in sight and start thinking about who you can move. You're always going to be able to find one person, hopefully. And if not, maybe you're in the wrong organization. But you should be able to at least find one person who is an ally, who is an advocate, and how to move that person and get that person to use their influence and their power to move other folks. And I think that's how, that's how all systems change works. It's kind of like finding one by one, two by two, and eventually making those small incremental changes to hopefully make those big changes within your organization.
Thanks, Stephanie. We'll go to our next question. Do you think certain due diligence processes hinder the granting to organizations that need it the most?
Yeah. So there's this series called Move the Money that I think is really powerful. And if you haven't listened to it, you should be able to go there on YouTube. But one of the things that they talk about in terms of funding movements and social change is kind of like the barriers that exist in granting. And I think that, like at the most burdensome, you might have like a government grant, right? I remember I had a grant program that I worked for, and we had monthly reporting. And we were a 100+ organization. So monthly reporting wasn't that bad. I mean, it wasn't great, but it wasn't that bad. But some of these organizations who have maybe 5 to 10 staff members, monthly reporting is like just almost never going to be able to be something that they can maintain because it actually does take them away from the work that you're funding them to do. I also think that, one of the things Meyer has done and is doing like more within the Fund for Black-Led Change is changing how we do reporting. And so for the grantees who are in the Fund for Black-Led Change, what I tend to do is I have 2 options because, COVID is still happening. So I, have a virtual option, and then I ask folks if they want to come to lunch. And we have a conversation. And while we're having the conversation, I take notes. I go home, I type up those notes. I send them to the grantee to make sure I accurately reflected what they told me. They can make any changes, do any edits, let me know if there's something that they feel I misrepresented. And then that's their report, And so, hopefully I've taken about, well, sometimes with lunch, it goes a little bit longer, but an hour, maybe 2 hours of their time, sometimes fed them. And then that takes away, potentially hours worth of work that they would have spent doing a report for us. And so I do think that there are ways that you can switch some of the burden back onto the foundation. Even for some of like the financial reports, all 990s are publicly accessible. So we're not going to spend time asking them to submit that when we can find it ourselves. And so to lower kind of the burden of responsibility for the organizations, because we want them to spend less time doing that and more time doing the work we're funding them to do.
Thank you. We have another question here. The current IRS minimum for annual granting is 5%. What percent do you think should be the norm?
A lot larger than 5%. I can't speak for every foundation because I think, we have foundations who are doing a lot of really good work, and maybe they're hovering at 5% because their endowments are not that large. But I think particularly when you have foundations who have really large endowments, I can't say a specific number because I don't think that would be accurate for everyone, but I do think that it needs to be higher than 5%. I personally am working on that at Meyer. I think that we should go much higher than what we're funding at currently. And I also think, you look at who you are in community with. So for example, Meyer, in funders who consider themselves to do racial equity funding in the DC area, we should be leading. We have the biggest endowment of any of the other funders who are doing similar type of work. And so I think something that my dad always talked to me about was like, when you are in a position of privilege, you are called upon to lead, you're called upon to give more. And so I think that Meyer and other foundations are called upon to give more and to do more because of our relationship to power, because of the way that we we hold ourselves up to be a leader. And so we are called to do more than what we're currently doing. I know that doesn't specifically answer your question. I don't have a, I don't have a number, but I would like to see Meyer get to at least 10%.
And I think for that, it varies, right, depending on the organization. And I think that's a fair answer. So it just depends. But where there's room, then there's where the changes could come. Aja, I'm not sure if there are any other questions in the Q&A box.
No, there is a comment though. Just says that these answers have been amazing. So thank you so much, Stephanie.
We love that. So I have another final question before we're going to close out. If there are no other questions, we'll give the audience another opportunity to put something in the Q&A box. But the question that I have for you, Stephanie, is, looking out 5-10 years from now, what do you see the philanthropic landscape looking like? And, what is your wish come true?
I hope, so as you mentioned, the Fund for Black-Led Change is not the only fund. In fact, I'm in the community with about 6 or 7 other, funders who are doing similar type of funds. And so one of the pitfalls is that most of them are time limited to about 3 to 5 years, I'd say. And so I would like to see funders really actually investing in social change work happening and being led by Black people. I think that, like we mentioned earlier, oftentimes Black people, other communities of color are closest to the problems. And so we are closest to the solutions. I think that there's a lot of work to be done in philanthropy and dismantling some of the inherent anti-Blackness that exists within the sector in terms of like how we think about who is a quote unquote safe bet in terms of funding, to think about our funding as reparative, right? By nature of having an endowment, we have harmed people, we have harmed communities. And so how do we think about the funding that we do as reparative and not necessarily charitable, right? We're not doing this because we want to be charitable. We're doing it because we have harmed and we need to make atonement for that harm. I hope that is, I see those conversations happening. I will also, admit that I am in somewhat of, spaces that, tend to already be having those conversations around capitalism, around racism, around anti-Blackness. So my perspective is a bit skewed, but I'm excited that those conversations are happening. I think that, as I've seen a lot of, my peers in the DC area and beyond having these conversations, there are material shifts happening within their foundations. And it's really exciting to see folks grapple with, going above 5%, grapple with even spending down their endowment, grappling with changing, leadership structure so that folks who are directly impacted have greater stake and greater say in those decision-making processes. And so I don't know if that's, more of like a stream or an ocean of change that's happening. But I'm excited for those conversations to start taking place. I hope in 10 years that I used to work for an organization whose tagline was like, till no one is hungry, right? They want to get rid of hunger. I don't know if 10 years is reasonable, but I hope that we, don't have to exist. That's my ultimate goal, is that we do our work so well that communities are fully funded and thriving, and that we're working ourselves out of a job. And so I would love to no longer have to have my job. I mean, I love my job, but I would love for it to not be a necessity. And so I think that should be the trajectory philanthropy should be working towards, is to do some of this dismantling. And so that also comes at like the expense of ourselves. Like, how can we change, how we structure, taxes so that, people are not hoarding wealth and that they're actually spending it and using it and inserting it back into, their communities. So yeah, that's where I hope to get. I'm not sure if that's the path we're on right now, but I'm very hopeful. I know that there are some really truly brilliant people who are doing the work out there. I mentioned so if y'all are not familiar with them, look them up. They're really great. Hill Snowden is doing great work. I think there's a lot of really brilliant people who I'm really grateful to be able to learn and be in community with.
Well, I appreciate that. That got more questions in the Q&A. I think. So Aja, are there other questions? We do have 10 minutes before the top of the hour. So are there questions in the Q&A?
Yes, so there's one more kudos. I would like to make sure we have time for that. So it says, thank you for hosting this insightful conversation. So thank you so much for typing that in the Q&A. And then we have another one here as well. So I am in Prince William County and want to partner with existing organizations serving youth and families to address prominent issues. My firm focuses on providing support in addressing pressing issues facing children, youth, families, and marginalized groups. I have not had much success with the local organizations, schools included, to find a way to help me in ways that may have never considered, but really need. Any recommendations on how to address this in a county as large as ours, which is the second largest in Virginia, which has become increasingly diverse, but our approaches to community solutions has not evolved?
So I'm not super familiar with Prince William County, to be fair. So I'm probably not the person to be able to give you solutions, but it does sound like there's some base building work that needs to happen. If one person or one organization is the only one making demands or beating the drum, it sounds like you need to expand your base. So, those communities of color who, you're hoping to do work with, who you're hoping to be able to bring more diverse solutions, they probably already have some of those thoughts. So working directly with them, building bases with them, I think is really important. Although all of the organizations that Meyer funds are systems change organizations, meaning they're not direct service. Many of them use direct service to do systems change. And we know that if people's material conditions are not met, they're not likely to be out there organizing, right? Because they're trying to figure out how to get housed, how to pay their bills, how to feed their family. So meeting some of those material conditions in collaboration with that systems change work, I think can be really powerful.
Oh, more questions. Okay, we'll take two more if we have time. And then we will, for those questions that we don't get to, we will make sure in our follow-up to provide responses to those. So Aja, can you take two more questions, please?
Yeah, they're more so comments in regards to the last question, but just for some information sharing, it says, great question about Prince William County. Folks are being pushed out of DC and immediate suburbs due to affordable housing, et cetera. We'd love to see some more organizing there. And then we had a response that says, reach out to the United Way NCA to assist with finding ways to get involved in Prince William County.
Yes, and I actually my closing comment. So I'll be able to get that. If there are no further questions, Stephanie, this has been my absolute pleasure to have this conversation with you today. I've learned so much. It's been wonderful. And for the audience, I do want to take some time to thank all of you for joining us for this critical conversation and discussion on racial equity and how we can work together to reduce barriers to uplift our entire community. At United Way of the National Capital Area, we truly do believe that when none are ignored, all will thrive. To learn more about resources available in the region, please visit unitedwaynca.org/changemakers. That's unitedwaynca.org/changemakers. Have a wonderful day. And thank you again, Stephanie, for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.